So we're going to do Unit 2, Lesson 3. The name of the lesson is Complex Numbers and Quadratic Equations. My marker's not writing. Hang on just a second. Complex numbers and quadratic equations. All right, so this should be page 9 in your notes packet. All right. So here's the first thing. If we take the square root of 4, what do we get? We get 2 because 2 times 2 is equal to 4. Right? How about the square root of 1? It's going to be 1 because 1 times 1 is equal to 1, right? How about the square root of a negative 1? What would you guess it is? You would think so, right? But if we do a negative 1 times a negative 1, we get a positive 1 because a negative times a negative gives me a positive. So I can never take the square root of any negative number and get a real number. I can't do the square root of a negative number. Right? So because of that, we call the square root of negative 1 an imaginary number. All right? It's a non-real number. So this imaginary number, we symbolize it with I, and I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay? That's a huge thing. So I is equal to the square root of negative 1. We just say that's an imaginary number. Okay? All right. If on your guys' calculator you try to do the square root of negative 1, it's going to say error, non-real answer. Right? Try it real quick. Doesn't work, right? It says non-real. Okay, so you can change the mode on there so that it will work. Let me show you how to do that. If you guys go to mode, right by the yellow button, and if you come down to where it says real on the left and go over and select A plus BI, that's going to be putting it into what we call complex number mode. And if you hit enter, and now you quit, and now if you do the square root of negative 1, it should give you I. Okay? So when we're working with I's, you want your calculator to be in that mode. All right? Cool. So, again, key understanding is that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay? So now we can work through some different powers of I that we're going to see have different values, and you guys are going to need to memorize this pattern that we're going to develop. Let's start with I squared. That would be the same thing as I times I, right? And I just said that I is equal to the square root of negative 1, right? So I times I is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. And if I do that, I'm going to end up with a negative 1. Okay? How about I to the third power? Well, that's going to be the same thing as I squared times I to the first power. Oh, I should have mentioned. Up here in my box, when it just says I is equal to negative 1, my exponent there is really a 1, right? That's I to the first power. So I to the third power is equal to the I squared times I That's going to be I squared is the square root of negative 1. Oh, my bad. We just said that I squared is equal to 1, and I is just itself, so I get 1 times I, and that's going to give me I. Okay? So I to the 4th is going to be the same thing as I squared times I squared. We know that I squared is equal to negative 1. Damn, I messed up on the last one. So this right here, I squared is actually a negative 1. So a negative 1 times I gives me a negative I for I to the 3rd power. Okay? So I to the 4th power, I have I squared times I squared. That's a negative 1 times a negative 1. And a negative 1 times a negative 1 gives me a positive 1. So if I then come back up here and include I to the 1st power and say that I to the 1st power is equal to just I, right here I have my 4-step pattern. I to the 1st power is I to the 2nd power is negative 1, I to the 3rd power is negative I, and then I to the 4th power is positive 1. What we're going to see is that pattern is just going to repeat for I to the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And then it'll keep repeating for 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. You guys, this is the pattern right here that we're going to memorize or need to know right there. So let's keep cruising on down below. Do you guys have this copied down so far? Actually, as a matter of fact, before I clear over here, let's take these values now and let's bump them over to this table. So I to the 1st power, we just call that I. Anything to the 1st power is just itself. I to the 2nd power, we said was negative 1. We said I to the 3rd power is a negative I, and I to the 4th power is a positive 1. Okay, can you guys fill in that chart real quick? So it just goes I, negative 1, negative I, positive 1. Okay, good to go? Okay, it's okay, we'll get you caught up.